Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Well, to start things off today, the Russian operation in the north, in the direction of Kupiansk, continues. It appears that Russian forces have made an initial breakthrough just to the south of Kupiansk, while at the same time continuing to drive northeast of Kupiansk as well. So it appears that the Russians are trying some sort of pincer maneuver within the area near Kupiansk. I've talked about this for some time, that the Russians were indeed and are building up very large forces in this area, especially north of Seversk, running all the way up to the Russian border proper, to the southeast of Belgorod and east of Kharkov. But again, Russian forces appear to have broken through this area. Let's do a quick time lapse of what we're seeing on the ground to give you, the viewer, a better idea of what has happened over the last day. So here you can see Russian forces initiate offensive operation southeast of Kupiansk, and you can see here that this area was broken through. It's not a large salient, but nonetheless, it is a push forward, and it is achieving some success. As of right now, I would say the offensive that we're seeing in this area east of Kupiansk, running north of Seversk, is probably having more success than what the Ukrainians tried down in Zaporizhzhia. Now, the reason I say that is if you listen to some of the content providers that are diehard Ukrainian supporters, they're concerned about this Russian offensive in and around Kupiansk. It is something that I believe at this point they are hearing, or they're getting information from the ground that is articulating that the Ukrainian position is tenuous in this area. Obviously, the Ukrainians moved large amounts of forces in hopes that the Zaporizhzhia offensive would have been successful. A successful Zaporizhzhia offensive, running from Zaporizhzhia all the way east towards Volhodar, would have allowed the Ukrainians some political collateral. They would have been able to dictate to the Russians, if this offensive in Zaporizhzhia were successful, they would have been able to dictate to the Russians, look, we have severed, or we are about to sever, your main land corridor to Crimea, and thus that would have negated the offensive that we're now seeing within the vicinity of Kupiansk. So in terms of leverage, negotiating power, they would have had the ability to dissuade the Russians from an ongoing offensive in the Kupiansk sector. That did not occur. The Ukrainian offensive in Zaporizhzhia failed, and failed catastrophically. Again, 30-35% casualty rates, while at the same time, the Russians have built up 100 to 110,000 troops, 900 to 1,100 tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and have launched this offensive in the northeast quadrant of the ongoing conflict. And again, as of right now, the Russians have achieved a breakthrough along the main front lines and are continuing this crushing pressure attack in this area. While at the same time this is going on, the Russians have launched continued steel rain operations within the vicinity of Odessa, Mykolaiv, and other places in and throughout Ukraine, especially the port areas, the port facilities, military targets in Odessa are being constantly struck. The Russians now have, for 3 or 4 days, launched waves of cruise missiles, ballistic missile strikes, airstrikes against targets in and around Odessa, this area here. At this point, the Ukrainians launched retaliatory strikes, retaliatory drone strikes against Russian targets, supposedly near Moscow. Now, we do understand that because of the robust air defense network that is in and around Moscow, those drones were jammed and ended up hitting the tops of civilian skyscrapers and what have you. Now, to some effect, we're seeing the same thing when the Russians try to attack Kiev, and we have seen Russian drones, we have seen Russian cruise missiles getting shot down near Kiev. Not all of them are shot down, some do get through, but unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they don't have the same volume amount of cruise missiles to fire and drones to fire at Russian targets in Moscow. Compounding that, the Russians are going after other targets where there is not a robust air defense network, such as Patriot air defense batteries, such as Odessa. So the Ukrainians only have a finite amount of Patriot batteries, and right now they're using those batteries and other more advanced Western air defense systems to protect Kiev. They're using some of their older systems, such as S-300s, to defend Odessa, Mykolaiv, Lviv, and other sites in western Ukraine. But the Russians have a pretty good idea on how to deal with those systems and have been able to penetrate those systems, that air defense ring near Odessa, and continue to hit targets in and around Odessa. Now, circling back to some of the content providers that are covering this conflict, and unfortunately, for the average person wanting to find out information, there's two choices. You can go to the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is just really bad in terms of factual reporting on what's going on within the confines of the conflict. The other resource is content providers. Now, you do have certain content providers who, for instance, have fled Ukraine and are now living in, for instance, Germany or Switzerland or what have you. And they are under the impression that the quote-unquote average Ukrainian would not accept a territorial loss by Ukraine from Russia. Now look, those individuals stating that are just as I have talked about. They fled Ukraine. So some of the most virulent individuals talking about no compromise, no territorial concessions, are not even in Ukraine. They took off, they fled, they utilized fleeyourcountry.org and are no longer present in Ukraine. Yet they are stating that there should be no territorial concessions between Russia and Ukraine. But again, they're not there. They avoided the Ukrainian draft and have since fled. Now, I get it. I guess if you're living in that environment, if you're living in Switzerland, it's very easy for you to say no negotiation, no compromise, when other people are doing the fighting in your stead. Anyway, I'm not going to get too much into that, but I think that gives you a pretty good a picture of what is kind of happening in some sectors of Ukrainian society. There are many Ukrainians who want to see an end to this conflict. And unfortunately for many Ukrainians, most Ukrainians, there is no end in sight for this conflict. A lot of money has been spent, 70, 80, 90, $100 billion by Western powers. There are in the circles of the Western power base within the confines of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They want to see this war to continue to quote unquote bleed Russia dry. We hear Lindsey Graham here in the United States, Ladybug Lindsey Graham, just bad. Again, I've talked about it. I don't even know how that individual is elected time and time again, yet he is. He would never send his own children, because he doesn't have any children, by the way, to send in this conflict. And he himself would never fight in an armed conflict. And it's those sorts of people who are kind of driving this war. These people who have never been in war, never served in. He did serve in the military. I believe he was in the Air Force and in the rear with the gear. And he did his time, and he avoided any service like the Army, Marine Corps, where he could possibly be put in harm's way. But it's those sorts of people, people who fled the Ukraine and are now demanding certain things occur, people who have never served in frontline combat units demanding that other people's children go fight in their stead. And that's really unfortunate. And Lindsey Graham's a shitbag, and I'm not going to get into that. Anyway, but I just did, didn't I? Anyway, back to where we were. Again, we're going to watch what's happening very closely east of Kupiansk as this Russian offensive continues. We're going to continue to probably see these waves of cruise missile strikes by Russian forces against targets in Odessa and other areas. And look, I get that the Ukrainians are saying that some sensitive targets were hit in Odessa, but look, the reality is, if the Russians wanted to launch a significant strike against civilian targets and kill a lot of Ukrainians, they have that capability, and we haven't seen that happen. Okay, I believe the loss of civilian life in Odessa was 1 civilian and 22 injured. That is not a sign that the Russians have decided to start obliterating civilian targets. If that were in fact the case, the casualty level on the part of the Ukrainians would be just astronomical. There wouldn't be 1 dead and 22 wounded. There would be 96 dead and 345 dead. Okay? And that's just a simple fact. The Russians are not actively trying to target Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. It's not happening. What is happening is Ukrainian air defense systems are missing their targets. Ukrainian air defense systems are hitting Russian inbound missiles and causing them to deviate from their assigned military objectives and multi-use objectives. But again, the casualty rates would be much, much higher if the fact was that the Russians were targeting Ukrainian civilians. And we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that happen. Now, that's where we're at for today. We will, of course, continue to report. Thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. And as always, have a good day.